already going for a 2000s dive this spooky season, and today's addition to the fold is Tim Burton's Corpse Bride. Coming out within the same 2-week window of Wallace and Gromit, Curse of the Were-Rabbit, 2005 was truly the year of stop-motion horror-themed movies, it seems, starring Helena Bonham Carter set in a fictional English village. Weird that it happened twice at practically the same time. But anyway, this movie, as opposed to Nightmare Before Christmas, was actually properly co-directed by Tim Burton, and also gets the notable accolade of being the first feature-length production from Laika Studios. It all, to a certain extent, started right here, and of course, this is an absolute classic. So today, let's come and have a look at Patient Zero of the Laika filmography. This is The Amazing Corpse Bride. Here we go. Oh yeah, it's a musical, by the way. I don't know if that's obvious from the marketing alone, but it kind of threw me off the first time.
A day for a glorious wedding.
Maybe not quite as memorable as the This Is Halloween opening, despite similarities, but still does the job it needs to incredibly well. Setting us up to the town, and more importantly, the townsfolk's social attitudes towards class and status, which will of course play a big part of this movie's story. Not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but it's a solid, here's all the weird characters introduced in the context of the movie whilst doing quirky stuff kind of number. Once again, giving us a character called Victor, really linking us more to Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
Victor? How lovely.
Both trying to woo a young aristocrat as well, what do you know? And immediately we're in with the cobwebs. Absolutely no saturation to be seen at all. There is no sun in the Tim Burton universe, it's just day moon and night moon apparently. To be fair, as we'll get into it, there's thematically more to this artistic choice in this particular movie than just this is what Tim does.
Shouldn't Victoria Everglot be marrying a lord or something?
A subtle performance from Johnny Depp? Surely not.
It's a pathetic attempt.
Genuinely, I wouldn't have known it was him. The accent's pretty good. He plays Victor, the most British man ever. By which I mean most of his dialogue is just him saying sorry to everyone.
I do apologise, Miss Everglot. How rude of me. Excuse me.
He is very much the spooky season version of the Hugh Grant rom-com archetype, you know what I mean? And this guy finds himself poised to get married to Victoria. Victor and Victoria, huh? Can I even phrase that as a joke? Yeah. The marriage is very much put on by their parents, so we're going straight into an arranged marriage storyline here. Kind of a classic, but hey, it's 2005, I'll allow the trope. It also seems like quite an unlikely arrangement, with Victoria's family being the snooty aristocrats, whilst Victor's family being lowly fish merchants.
Welcome to our home.
Oh, thank you.
However, we soon learn that Victor's family have come into new money through their business, whilst Victoria's parents are running out of money. A nice spin on the usual trope and adds a little extra conflict layer, which leaves us in the situation where they've resorted to this arrangement whilst also completely resenting the family it involves. Meanwhile, despite now being the wealthier party, Victor's parents are still the groveling ones who desire the perceived extravagant lifestyle of the aristocrats. It's just the first taste of what this movie has to say on obsessions of wealth and status, but we'll see plenty more of that as we continue. Thankfully, the central couple seem to hesitantly like each other, which initially kind of muddles what the story was meant to say about this kind of arrangement, but yeah, it's fine. But indeed, they do have some chemistry, as shown by this cute little piano scene. The simple idea of music being the romantic catalyst to bring characters together.
You play beautifully.
Always sweet when it's done in cinema. And the fact that the animators had to move his individual fingers and edit the shots to play this music convincingly is still something that boggles my mind. This is something we still praise in the modern day. This is just incredible attention to detail. And it's all just a nice way of setting up their relationship without having much to say, though Victoria's mum doesn't quite get the memo. Very much the uptight, high-status character, she can't have the happy couple building a connection before the wedding rehearsal. Man, she would have absolutely sunk her teeth into Married at First Sight. Anyway, she splits them up and we head to the wedding rehearsal. Christopher Lee turns up as the priest, whose head looks like a weird runner bean.
I meant, no, I do not wish to be married.
Oh, okay. And then the movie turns into the king's speech. Victor, being the apologetic stutterer archetype that he is, can't get his vows together and upsets all the repulsive, toxic characters around him in the process. And things get bad to worse when Victor then instigates a bit of knockout comedy. The perfect cringe style of humor that 50-50 when it comes to my perception of it. though that waiter pulls an amazing catch. Gotta give him some love. Victor is then ousted out of the room and runs off to go practice for these awful people, whereby he walks into what looks like the Nightmare Before Christmas portal forest. I'm sure there's some theory connecting all the Tim Burton movies unnecessarily. Makes sense. Then for the thing this movie really promises us on, early doors. Gotta appreciate the usual first act preamble up to this point though, doing what it needs to do, but also doesn't outstay its welcome. I mean, obviously when it comes to stop motion, you gotta be careful with your frames, but so far, this beginning section I think's just immaculate for the contextual setup of the movie.
Well, he's quite the catch, isn't he?
And of course, being the unluckiest man ever, whilst Victor practices his vows, he just so happens to place the ring on a twig that turns out to absolutely not be a twig.
With this ring, I ask you to be mine.
Reciting the vows, the twig starts to move and we get the emergence of the bride. This, from a narrative perception, is such a unique riff to run with for a story. Like, who thinks, oh yeah, we'll go in this direction now? This guy goes into the woods and whilst rehearsing his vows for an arranged marriage, accidentally recites them to a dead bride-in-waiting whose hand corpse is sticking out of the ground. How do you reach that idea? And when I saw this the first time, I was genuinely surprised because I thought the original Victoria girl was gonna be the corpse bride. But no, there's another bride who is a corpse. It's genuinely so incredibly creative. 2005, man. Why is there only sequels in the modern day? I just can't comprehend the imagination that willed this story into existence. And we haven't actually seen the rest of the execution yet. The world and story building style established has already won me over, only to follow on with this unlikely convergence of events. And this whole reveal sequence of the bride is just impeccably done as well. This is the movie's big inciting incidents, and they don't waste in execution whatsoever. Considering where we then go with the bride as a character, they make sure we first get a solid introductory sequence of "this is super creepy." The whole reveal sequence does the movie's namesake justice and makes sure that we get a solid PG-rated scare sequence before learning anything else about her. She is a corpse. Although I can't really make a solid call if this is too scary for kids. And considering a lot of people find that stop motion has that unnerving quality, this movie definitely plays to the strengths of that. You know, you got that wiry character design and jerky movements that are all just superb to see translating the idea of a literal walking corpse. Anyway, the bride pursues Victor through the woods, Victor making every "I'm gonna clumsily fumble around everything" routine just to keep us on our toes. Why did he tackle it? Oh my god, this is... Naturally, he gets up to the bridge, so he's far enough for at least one person to see him before he turns around and the bride's right there for a big ol' smooch. Throughout this movie as well, I really like the use of the crows as a symbol between the dead and the living. Obviously, that's historically been known iconography. However, it's incorporated particularly well in this movie, which has links together to the world of the undead and the living. It's nice to see thematic symbolism, you know, in a movie. Getting a little artsy with the concepts, you know? 2005, man. And I can only imagine these must have been done with CGI as well. I mean, stop motion for all of these crows would be impossible as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that's our cue to enter the world of the dead. And they're all having a little party. Cool.
My name is Paul. I am the equator.
There's always one silly pun I like begrudgingly. Now, something to point out here that I enjoy is that the land of the dead is actually the world that is so much more colorful and lively than the land of the living. As I highlighted at the start, the color palette for the town is an assortment of grays and blacks, and as a colorblind guy living in Britain, this is basically just reality to me. You know, it reflects the misery that the living cause on themselves by the restrictions that they apply to themselves. Whereas here in the underworld, it doesn't matter anymore. You're dead now, might as well just get on with enjoying yourself. It is definitely no accident that the land of the dead here presents as more alive than the real world. And that's because it wasn't. They highlight this immediately in the behind-the-scenes documentary. Of course they do. Burton himself points out how regimented the land of the living is by formality and status, whereas that doesn't matter once you're in the land of the dead. Whilst we don't exactly live in a Victorian society anymore, not entirely anyway, it is still a wholly original way of delivering that message of the limitations we can put on ourselves based on the society around us, and how we'd be a lot happier if we just broke away from them. That's what I'm taking away from it anyway. anyway, rather than it's better to be dead. The backgrounds are all lit in greens, reds, and purples, the more skeletal corpse characters reflecting this light off of themselves. And even without the lighting, the skeletons are distinctly a dirty yellow, not a shade of white. Even when we meet the bride herself, she's a striking shade of blue against the monochrome backdrop of the woods. It's such an interesting riff on the Wizard of Oz pastiche of going from one world to another. Except, of course, instead of munchkins, it's dead people.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
The characters as well are also immediately interesting to look at and each have their quirks of bits falling off. We get this world building sequence in almost every animated movie where it cuts between different nameless characters and their in-universe quirks, but this is certainly a solid example of that and could very easily be the inspiration for all sorts of future examples, which of course would pull from other sources as well, but you could see some sort of through line between the two. Not to mention the song number for this sequence really shows the inventiveness of how they animate the world. You've got a band of skeletons led by a character called Mr. Bone Jangles, of course, doing a song number with instruments made out of themselves, and the instrumental choices are made to sound like that. I know this is very much out of the playbook of that old Betty Boop cartoon, which, to be fair, they fully credit as an influence. However, there is plenty of originality on show here as well. Unsurprisingly, regular Burton collaborator Danny Elfman is who we have to thank for this brilliantly put together number. Fun fact, that's also him on the lead vocals, just like he did with Jack Skellington. So yeah, we're 2 for 2 now on Elfman's skeleton vocals. Better still, it's used to give us the bride's backstory in an entertaining and exciting manner. Not just on the instrumental side, there's also just some really inventive choreography in this song number, with the skeletons swapping heads and whatnot to the music. It all just comes together to form these fascinating formations and patterns that just showcases an animation team that is absolutely reveling in what they are doing. Could you even say some of the best animation of the decade? Why not? And in the midst of it all, we learn about the bride's tragic past, in which she was set for marriage and killed in the forest at night.
That's the story of our
There we are. They got the title in there somehow. We head back to the damp world of the living, the smash cut to which really illustrating this contrast. This is where we get the fallout of Victor's disappearance, to which the groundskeeper pops in to report his apparent affair.
Master Van Dort slipped away into the night. Another weather.
The perfect time to be introduced to this Jay Leno looking guy.
Ah, Lord Barkis.
Ah, what an interesting suspicious character fellow to suddenly join the roster of the cast. And he's voiced by Richard E. Grant, who's gonna be bad news. But once this scene concludes its brief existence to establish both the shady villain and Victor's disappearance, we then immediately head back to him and the bride.
Victor, where have you gone?
Victor?
Hold on, so let's get this straight. There were 2 stop-motion movies released within 2 weeks of each other, which both feature Helena Bonham Carter repeatedly calling out the name Victor? What are the odds of that?
Thank you.
Huh. Second-hand shop? Oh, I'm digging these visual gags. And in keeping up with the strange protagonistic trope of Tim Burton movies always featuring a doggy companion, now we get the introduction of this skelly dog, turning out to be Victor's long-deceased dog Scraps.
Scraps?
Again, almost unnecessary, but it's just a wholesome little moment. That's crazy, to make the concept of the world of the dead so inviting. Maybe inviting's not the right word there, but you know what I mean? Anyway, the bride, or Emily as we learn here, is making attempts to connect with Victor as a person rather than insert husband here. A nice, genuine extra layer to what could have otherwise just been a straight up villain the whole time. However, then Victor goes down a plot to manipulate Emily to meet his family in pursuit of returning to his world. And naturally, it's still manipulation on one character to the other, at least you can kind of understand where he's coming from. The guy was just trying to practice his wedding vows and now he's in the underworld and betrothed to a corpse. I'd probably want to go home too. Nonetheless, poor old Emily buys into it. We then head to the lair of Elder
Connect.
What she said. Hey there, you made it to the halfway part of this video, so come along and subscribe if you're interested in talking about more amazing movies. This will probably be a consistent series from now on, so let me know other movies you'd like me to gush about. Or hey, I quit Twitter 2 years ago and now Blue Sky is a thing, so I'm on there if you want to follow. It's okay if not, it's very casual. But when else do I get to mention social media? So feel free to look me up if you want to see more of the man behind the screen. Anyway, back to the rest of Tim Burton's amazing Corpse Bride.
Elder Connect.
And his design's like a 1.5 feet tall. They managed to make a skeleton look elderly. Being the knowledgeable wizard type character of this story, he's able to create a concoction to send them back.
Now then, where were we?
Nice one. Oldie but a goldie. And a little bit of magic later, they head back to the woods where this whole fiasco began.
I'd almost forgotten how beautiful the moonlight is.
Oh, glad you enjoy that, because you're not getting any sun from Tim Burton. To be fair, I do love how the moonlight has more colour and personality in a world where clearly the sun just isn't a thing. Britain.
Go chew someone else's ear for a while.
God, this dialogue is absolutely on par with the Were-Rabbit script. If anything, it's more underplayed here, which I really like, actually. It trusts that its wit will come across by itself without an overly comical delivery. Halloween 2005 was like the golden age. This, of course, all backfires. Victor does get to Victoria, Emily sees what's going on, and the core conflict unravels itself.
I'm his wife.
One thing I don't like, though, is that Victor's seemingly bound by that narrative law that he's, for some reason, not allowed to explain the situation properly. And when he does, he completely cocks it up with the worst way possible to explain it.
You don't understand. She's dead. Look.
They do establish, to be fair, that he's not great at speaking, so there is at least a little bit of justification in his character, but of course it always can be quite frustrating when clearly there is a better way to communicate his situation. Although, to be fair, he is married to a literal reanimated corpse, so it's kind of hard to, it is a toughie, to be fair. Outraged, Emily takes Victor back to the underworld, and as for Victoria, she finds that no one wants to believe the fact that Victor's been abducted by a blue phantom lady. To be fair, the fact that he did get kidnapped is the best way to communicate that there ever was.
You lied to me!
And just like that, we have the leads falling out beat. Lovely stuff. And as typical of any movie, the maggot and the spider have a duet.
If he only knew the you that we knew.
It's weird because with the songs, the skeletons being an exception, aren't what I'd call super memorable. You know, it's the B-side of Elfman's efforts on Nightmare. However, in the overall context of the movie, they just work really incredibly well. It feels like the movie has a consistent language and style of storytelling, and the music fully blends into that. It adds something more profound and poetic to the film's overall voice. Sometimes the songs and the score can be completely at odds with each other, which is how jarring breaking into songs often happen. But here, it all just flows together. It's so good. I feel like this is underrated discography here. Anyway, Victoria then goes to the priest for answers about the afterlife. I love that his nightcap is the same length as his priest hat. It's the small details, you know? Love the character designs of stop motion characters. He, of course, also doesn't believe her, and the arranged marriage squad get together to decide what needs to be done. Thankfully, old Killer Chin is still around to take on the task himself.
You have only to suffer this union until death do us part.
You know, it's nice sometimes to have an unambiguous villain, or one that you know is meant to be a mystery, but you can very clearly work it out before the characters do. Maybe just 10 years of Disney avoiding that trope has made me more inclined to that kind of figure, you know? Let evil guys be evil. We can revel in it. But yeah, so then they decide that the marriage must continue on, with Lord Barkis now doing the job. Being completely written out of the picture, Victor's parents head off to look for him. However, unbeknownst to them, their driver suddenly dies. What a turnaround of a plotline. A canon death in a movie? Wonder where he might turn up.
How nice to see you.
Oh look, there he is. Though, just before that, we also have the more ambiguous part of the chemistry between Victor and the bride. After their squabble, when, he completely lied to her to get home, they have a genuinely tender moment here. And it's a nice touch that the piano motif is brought back to symbolize their chemistry building, almost like that's Victor's love language. Sorry, Victoria. Dead people can be homewreckers too. Wearing its love triangle on its chest, as well as being such an original triangle, it's far more interesting than what most movies cough up with this kind of storyline. Despite the absurdity of the situation, the movie does genuinely have you buy into the romance going either way. And ironically enough, it almost seems like the corpse bride has more chemistry with Victor for actually having the ability to play piano as well. Then finally, Victor and the driver get to communicate. He seems absolutely fine after choking to death and now reawakening with absolutely no purpose and no restrictions, as is the theme of the afterlife, where Victor hears from the now dead coach driver that Victoria is set to marry someone else, which leaves him to the conclusion that, oh cool, the hot corpse is fair game now. However, in this movie's weird lore, and I love that it goes goes in such strange, unique directions. The narrative is really, really cool. In order to marry Emily, to get around the old till death do us part link, when she's already dead thing, Victor must be dead too.
I could never ask him.
You don't have to.
And so, Victor agrees to kill himself. Oh my god! Yeah, it does sound like quite an extreme plot point when I just spell it out like that. The context of the movie and the land of the dead may make that seem less literal, but that's legitimately what he's doing, and that's crazy that it works and still ends up almost wholesome. Victor agrees to drink poison and join the land of the dead. Well, I guess this concept at least makes the ending of Romeo and Juliet a little bit happier. And it does make sense in the story that you're telling, but maybe this plot beat leaves slightly more questionable messages for a younger audience. And that's not even getting into the fact that this movie makes being dead look more fun than the desaturated, soulless land of the living. But I think there's a good amount of nuance and, extra layerings to just make such a two-dimensional take on this movie. And so now we get another musical number to celebrate Victor's simultaneous wedding and funeral, the spider summoning up her gang to do up his suit. Arachnophobes look away. They go full steam ahead with the ceremony within seconds of the decision, and to really stick it to the boring town on the surface world, Victor invites them all upstairs to cause havoc. And havoc is indeed caused. I didn't know that was allowed in the rules, they'd just all be invited up. But here we are. We get an incredibly satisfying scene of the uptight aristocrats getting the full undead experience. And visually, it's just so satisfying to see the climactic blend of the desaturated surface dweller characters and the colourful undead characters mixing.
You don't know me, but I used to live in your dead mother.
Perhaps the most morbid "your mum" joke of all time. And after a montage of the ghouls scaring everyone, in a real twist that again threw me through a loop more than the corpse bride being a corpse bride, there's a full-on wholesome turn coming into play. Presuming all these dead people came from the neighboring cemetery in the woods, what starts as a horrific invasion then just becomes a heartwarming reunion. Tim Burton's cursed-looking version of a heartwarming reunion anyway. Couples and grandparents reunited, it's another inventive choice to go with for this movie, and it's not even essential to the main storyline. I don't even think they really mention that they were from this town or they miss any of their living relatives. But it doesn't matter, because no pun intended, it further fleshes out this movie, its themes, and its core concept, and adds a nice, wholesome, emotive flush into a movie that already has a lot of heart and style and classicism to it. We then proceed to the church, where the priest has a short-lived go at keeping them all out.
Back to the void from whence you came!
That doesn't work, and presumably his entire profession and worldview is forever shaken. The ceremony begins, but the love triangle isn't over as Victoria sneaks in too. And despite the strangeness and morally questionable nature of the situation, the vows themselves are genuinely tender and poetically written. However, it is then that Emily realizes how wrong the situation actually is. And side note, I love this beat from the well-dressed skeletons.
She's having second thoughts.
Just as well we get in that little gag, as then Emily's monologue is genuinely heartbreaking.
I was a bride. My dreams were taken from me. Now I've stolen them from someone else.
One thing I will say is that Victor is quite easily let off of the situation here, as if he had no agency, although of course he had thought that Victoria had run off with someone else.
I love you, Victor, but you're not mine.
It's so strange because, by all accounts, this is an incredibly weird situation, but as Emily invites Victoria to the altar, I can't help but buy into what transpires as an incredibly touching scene. But of course, it can't be that simple, because Victoria herself is still forcibly betrothed to a Chin.
I'll not leave here empty-handed!
It's the moment this movie has been building up to, the reunion of Barkis and the bride. His dialogue here is a bit generic, however the whole vibe here is Victorian melodrama, so it doesn't necessarily spoil things.
You,
Emily.
Oh, here we go, the big plot twist. Ooh. I'm sure some kids felt pretty smart for working it out early.
I left you.
the dead.
There it is. The dead folk go full outrage to revolt, the killer fully unveiled and ready to go for another round. with Victor and Barkis, of course, going into a duel, Victor being handed a fork of all things, and they run with that for a while.
Sorry.
But then the real satisfying beat occurs. As it first appears Barkis has impaled Victor, Emily pulls the cutlass out of herself and points it at her own killer. She orders him to leave, but before he goes, he can't help but chew the scenery for one more minute, eyeing himself a glass of that sweet wine on the table. Of course, actually being the poisoned chalice from before. He drinks it, dies, and the dead folk absolutely have at him. Does that make him double dead? Like, what do they do to a guy that's already dead? Do they eat him as a skeleton? Can he be more mutilated? Like, I have no idea. Regardless, we're then just left with the core love triangle. Satisfied at the sight of Victor and Victoria reunited, Emily begins to make her exit. However, Victor can't leave her without saying goodbye.
You set me free. Now I can do the same for you.
At first, her being set free seems to just refer to the events of the story. However, we then see the full extent of what she meant. Walking away from Victor and Victoria, Emily walks to the church doorway. She takes one last breath, now free. Contrasting from the crows at the start of the movie, she transforms into several butterflies, the symbol of the end of her life cycle. And just like that, the credits roll. No epilogue, no external extension. It's just, there's the end point, happily ever after, cut it early, no overstaying your welcome. Mwah. This movie really needs more love, man. I can't say this is a perfect movie, but it is genuinely such a great Halloween-y one. Not only do I love the animation and the humor, but even just the story itself is something I could genuinely say bears no resemblance to any other movie that I've seen in the best way. Now, I can kind of see why it didn't do well at the time. You know, it's hard to identify who this movie is exactly for, which is a nightmare for marketing. However, as an animated movie that may not be immediately part of your Halloween rewatch, I would say this one definitely needs to be added in. It doesn't help that it came out to clash alongside Wallace and Gromit Curse of the Were-Rabbit, so maybe those audiences just had to pick and choose between the two and they kind of cannibalized each other. But the movie didn't exactly do poorly. It made a solid $118 million, you know? Not to mention, it sparked off all the more things that Leica would make in the future, so it's not exactly a unsuccessful movie in a lot of lenses. But I would say it's an often forgotten gem and an absolute classic when it comes to unique and interesting stop-motion projects, even nowadays. And that was Tim Burton's amazing Corpse Bride. For now, my name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Do tell me your thoughts or any small details I might have not mentioned about the Corpse Bride, and I shall see you in a little bit.